The stranger rode into Redemption Creek on a Tuesday morning in late April 1876, dust clinging to his worn leather chaps, and his hat pulled low enough that most folks could only see the hard line of his jaw. Clara Thompson watched him from behind the mercantile counter, her hands stilling on the bolt of calico she had been measuring for Mrs. Henderson, and something in her chest tightened at the sight of him, not fear exactly, but recognition of a soul as weary as her own. The town had seen plenty of drifters come through in the years since the war ended, men with haunted eyes and empty pockets looking for something they could never quite name. Most stayed a night or two, drank themselves into oblivion at the Silver Star Saloon, and disappeared before sunrise. This one looked different somehow, though Clara could not have explained why if someone had asked. Maybe it was the way he dismounted with careful precision, as though his body ached but he refused to show it. Maybe it was how he spoke quietly to his horse, a dusty sorrel mare that looked as road-weary as her rider, stroking her neck before tying her to the hitching post outside the general store. "Another drifter," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice sharp with disapproval. "Mark my words, Clara, that one will be gone within the week. They always are. Men like that do not put down roots. They just take what they can and move on." Clara did not respond because Mrs. Henderson was already launching into a story about her nephew in Kansas City, who had a proper job at a bank and owned his own house at 25. And Clara had heard this story at least a dozen times before. Instead, she watched through the window as the stranger stretched his shoulders back, looked up and down the main street of Redemption Creek, as though cataloging every building, every person, every possible exit, and then walked with measured steps toward the land office 3 doors down. The land office, not the saloon, not the hotel. The land office. Clara finished measuring Mrs. Henderson's fabric, wrapped it in brown paper, took her money, and tried to ignore the curious flutter in her stomach. She had no business being curious about a stranger. She had learned that lesson the hard way 2 years ago when Thomas Reed had come through town with his smooth words and easy smile, courted her for 3 months, proposed marriage, taken the $200 she had saved from her work at the mercantile, and vanished in the night. Her father had died the previous winter, her mother had followed him 6 months later, and Clara had been left alone with a business to run and a heart that felt like broken glass in her chest. She was 23 years old and had decided that romance was for foolish girls who had not yet learned how cruel the world could be. She would run her mercantile, save her money, build a life of quiet independence, and never again trust a man who looked at her like she was something precious. The stranger emerged from the land office an hour later with papers in his hand and a slight easing in the set of his shoulders. Clara was rearranging the display of tin cups near the window and told herself she was not watching for him. When he pushed open the door to the mercantile, the bell above it chiming, she straightened and put on her professional smile. "Good morning," she said. "Welcome to Thompson's Mercantile. What can I help you find today?" Up close, she could see that he was perhaps 27 or 28, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of storm clouds over the prairie. He had a scar along his left cheekbone, faded white against sun-bronzed skin, and his hands, when he removed his gloves, were calloused and scarred from hard work. He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the strangest feeling that he was seeing more than just a shopkeeper behind a counter. "I need supplies," he said, his voice low and rough as though he had not used it much lately. "Nails, hammer, saw if you have one, rope, canvas for a temporary shelter, and enough food staples to last a couple weeks. Also grain for my horse. You are setting up camp somewhere?" Clara asked, moving behind the counter to start gathering his order. "I bought the Peterson place," he said. "Or what is left of it. Plan to rebuild." Clara's hands stilled on the sack of flour she had been reaching for. The Peterson place had been abandoned for 3 years. Ever since old man Peterson had died and his children back east had shown no interest in claiming the property. The house had burned down 2 winters ago, leaving only a stone foundation and a barn that was half collapsed. The land was good, 40 acres with a creek running through it and plenty of grazing, but it would take months of backbreaking work to make it livable again. "That is a big job for one man," she said carefully. "I have done bigger," he replied. There was no boast in his voice, just a statement of fact. She continued gathering his supplies, her mind working through calculations of what he would need. "You will want more nails than you think, and you should get some tar paper for the roof. It rains hard here in May." He nodded, watching her work with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable but somehow did not. "What else?" "Beans, flour, salt, coffee, dried beef, cornmeal, lard for cooking, a good skillet and a pot, matches, a lantern and oil, blankets if you do not have enough." She paused. "A rifle if you do not have one. We get coyotes out that way, and occasionally a mountain lion comes down from the hills." "I have a rifle," he said, "and a pistol, but I will take the rest." As Clara assembled his order, other customers came and went, and she could feel their eyes on the stranger, could almost hear the whispers starting. By supper time, everyone in Redemption Creek would know that a drifter had bought the Peterson place, and by tomorrow morning, half the town would have opinions about how long he would last. The total came to $43.60, a significant amount. He paid in cash without hesitation, pulling worn bills from an inside pocket. As Clara counted out his change, he spoke again. "My name is Matthias Kane," he said. "I appreciate your help, Miss Clara Thompson," she replied, meeting his eyes. They were steady and direct, and she saw something in them that surprised her, hope maybe, or determination. "And you are welcome, Mr. Kane." "Matthew," he said, "or just Kane. Most people call me Kane." "Then I will call you Matthew," Clara said, not entirely sure why she was being contrary. "Since most people are not always right about everything." The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile but close. "Fair enough, Miss Thompson." "Clara," she said before she could stop herself. This time he did smile, just a little, and it transformed his face, softening the hard edges and making him look younger. "Clara," he repeated, as though testing how her name felt in his mouth. He loaded his supplies into a borrowed cart from the livery, tied his horse to the back, and drove out of town, heading west toward the Peterson place. Clara watched him go and told herself firmly that she was simply being a good businesswoman, making note of a new customer who would likely need regular supplies while he rebuilt his property. She did not think about him again until that evening. Or at least she told herself she did not think about him, even though she found herself wondering if he had adequate shelter for the night, if he knew how cold the prairie got after sunset. If he was sitting alone by a campfire looking up at the same stars she could see through her bedroom window above the mercantile. The whispers started the next day, just as she had predicted. "I heard he is running from the law," said Mr. Brennan, who ran the feed store and thought he knew everything about everyone. "I heard he killed a man in Texas," added Mrs. Sullivan, the banker's wife, with the kind of relish people reserve for particularly juicy gossip. "He has that look," said old Pete from the livery. "That drifter look. He will work the land for a few months, sell it for whatever he can get, and move on. They always do." Clara kept her mouth shut and her opinions to herself, but she felt an unexpected flare of defensiveness on Matthew Kane's behalf. These people did not know him. They were judging him based on nothing more than the fact that he was a stranger, that he kept to himself, that he had the weathered look of a man who had seen hard times. But then, she reminded herself, they had judged Thomas Reed too, and they had been right about him. 3 days passed before Matthew Kane came back to town. Clara was helping young Timothy Watts pick out penny candy when the door opened and Matthew walked in, his shirt dusty and his face showing signs of exhaustion. He waited patiently while Timothy made his agonizingly slow decision between peppermint sticks and lemon drops, and when the boy finally left with his lemon drops, Matthew approached the counter. "I need more nails," he said, "and if you have any spare lumber, I will take whatever you can sell me." The barn is in worse shape than I thought. I can order lumber from the mill in Cooper's Bend, Clara said. It will take about a week to arrive, but it will be cheaper than what I have in stock, and you will get better quality. He nodded, pulling out a small notebook and a pencil stub. How much for enough to rebuild the barn? Clara did some quick calculations, thinking about the size of the Peterson barn from the few times she had been out that way years ago. Probably around $80, depending on exactly how much you need. If you can give me measurements, I can get you a more precise estimate. He wrote down numbers, his handwriting surprisingly neat for a man who looked like he spent more time holding a hammer than a pen. What about windows? The house foundation is solid enough to build on, but I will need windows and a door. I can order those too, Clara said. Are you planning to build the house yourself? Do not have money to hire help, he said simply. So yes, I will be building it myself. Over the next hour, they went through everything he would need, not just for immediate repairs, but for long-term rebuilding. Clara found herself drawn into the project despite her better judgment, suggesting more efficient ways to structure his purchases, pointing out which suppliers gave her the best quality, even sketching a rough floor plan on a piece of paper when he mentioned wanting to build a two-room house with a loft. You have done this before, Matthew observed, looking at her sketch. My father was a carpenter before he opened the mercantile, Clara explained. I used to help him with jobs when I was younger. I know enough to be useful even if I cannot swing a hammer as well as a man. I bet you could swing a hammer just fine if you wanted to, Matthew said, and there was no condescension in his voice, just honest assessment. Before she could respond, the door banged open and Sheriff Jacob Harding walked in, his hand resting casually on his gun belt in a way that was clearly meant to be noticed. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and square-jawed, and he had been trying to court Clara for the past 6 months despite her repeated gentle refusals. Kane, he said, his voice flat. I need to have a word with you. Matthew turned slowly, his body language relaxed but alert. Sheriff. I have been hearing things, Harding said. People are curious about you, about where you came from, what you are running from. I am not running from anything, Matthew said evenly. I bought property legally, I am rebuilding, that is all. Then you would not mind telling me where you were before you came to Redemption Creek. Clara saw Matthew's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. I was in Kansas. Before that, Missouri. Before that, I fought for the Union in the war. I have done cattle drives, ranch work, served as a deputy in a town in Nebraska for 2 years and saved my money. Now I want to build something of my own. Is that a crime, Sheriff? Harding's eyes narrowed. You have papers to prove any of that. I have my discharge papers from the Army, Matthew said, and a letter of recommendation from Sheriff Walters in Baxter, Nebraska, if you want to wire him and ask about my character. Anything else you want to know, you can ask me directly instead of listening to gossip. The two men stared at each other and Clara felt the tension in the air like a physical thing. Finally, Harding nodded slowly. I will be watching you, Kane. This is a peaceful town and I aim to keep it that way. Good, Matthew said. I came here for peace too. After Harding left, Matthew let out a long breath and turned back to Clara. Sorry you had to witness that. It was not your fault, Clara said, surprised by the anger she felt toward the sheriff. He has no right to harass you just because you are new in town. He thinks he is protecting the town, Matthew said. Cannot fault a man for that. I can fault him for being rude about it, Clara replied tartly. This time Matthew actually smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. You are a fierce one, are not you? Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. I just do not like seeing people treated unfairly. Neither do I, Matthew said quietly. That is part of why I want to build something here. I am tired of moving, tired of being the outsider. I want to prove that a man can change his circumstances if he is willing to work hard enough. Something in his words resonated deep in Clara's chest. I think you will, she said. Prove it, I mean. He looked at her for a long moment, and she had that strange feeling again, like he was seeing past all her carefully constructed walls to the lonely, hopeful person underneath. "Thank you," he said finally. "That means more than you probably know." Over the following weeks, Matthew became a regular presence in town, coming in every few days for supplies. He was always polite, always paid on time, and slowly, grudgingly, some of the townspeople began to soften toward him. Clara watched this transformation with interest, noting how Matthew went out of his way to be helpful, assisting old Mrs. Chen when her wagon wheel broke on Main Street, helping the Reverend replace some damaged shingles on the church roof, breaking up a fight between two drunk cowhands outside the saloon without throwing a single punch. But the whispers never quite stopped. He was still just a drifter, people said. Still just a man who would move on when something better came along. They pointed to the fact that he kept to himself, that he rarely socialized, that he worked from dawn to dusk on his property, and then returned to the small tent he had pitched near the barn foundation. Clara found herself thinking about him more than she wanted to admit. She told herself it was simply because he was an interesting person, someone different from the usual residents of Redemption Creek. She told herself it had nothing to do with the way her pulse quickened when she saw him walking toward the mercantile, or the way she found herself looking forward to their conversations about building plans and supply orders. One afternoon in mid-May, a sudden storm rolled across the prairie with the violence typical of spring. Rain lashed the windows of the mercantile, and thunder shook the building. Clara was doing inventory in the back room when she heard the bell above the front door chime. She emerged to find Matthew standing just inside, soaked through and dripping water onto her floor. "I am sorry," he said immediately. "I should have waited outside, but the lightning is bad." "Do not be ridiculous," Clara said, already moving toward the storeroom. "You will catch your death standing there in wet clothes. Wait here." She returned with a blanket and some towels which she thrust at him. "Dry off. I will put on some coffee." The mercantile had a small potbelly stove in the corner that Clara kept lit even in warmer weather for cooking and heating water. She busied herself with making coffee while Matthew dried his face and hair, and tried not to notice how his wet shirt clung to broad shoulders and a lean, muscled frame. "This storm came out of nowhere," Matthew said, accepting the cup of coffee she handed him gratefully. "I was on my way back from the mill in Cooper's Bend and barely made it to town before it hit." "You went to the mill yourself?" Clara asked, surprised. "That is a 4-hour ride." "Wanted to pick out the lumber personally," Matthew explained. "Make sure I was getting good quality. The owner there, Mr. Hendricks, gave me a fair price and even helped me load the wagon. It is waiting at the livery now." They stood together near the stove, listening to the rain pound against the roof and the thunder roll across the sky. The mercantile was warm and dry, and there was something intimate about sharing this small space while the storm raged outside. Clara was acutely aware of Matthew's presence beside her, of the way he smelled like rain and leather and honest sweat, of the careful way he held his coffee cup, as though afraid his work-roughened hands might break the delicate china. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said before she could lose her courage, of course. "Why here? Why Redemption Creek? There are bigger towns, better opportunities elsewhere." Matthew was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee. "Because of the name, partly," he said finally. "Redemption. It felt like a sign. And because it is small enough that a man can make a difference, can become part of something instead of just passing through. I spent too many years being nobody, going nowhere. I want to be somebody. Even if it is just a farmer on 40 acres, at least it will be my land, my home, my life." "You are already somebody," Clara said softly. "You do not need land to prove that." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw vulnerability in his eyes that took her breath away. "Maybe not," he said, "but I need it to prove it to myself." The storm passed and Matthew left, but something had shifted between them. Clara felt it like a change in the wind, subtle but undeniable. She found herself watching for him, listening for his voice, creating excuses to linger near the front of the store when she knew he might be coming to town. She also noticed that she was not the only one paying attention to Matthew Kane. Sheriff Harding seemed to be around whenever Matthew was in town, watching him with suspicious eyes. And there was Jenny Wilson, the pretty daughter of the saloon owner, who had started finding reasons to walk past the mercantile whenever Matthew's horse was tied outside. Her dresses a little tighter and her smiles a little wider than strictly necessary. Clara told herself she had no right to feel jealous. Matthew was not hers, he was not anybody's. He was just a customer, an acquaintance, someone she happened to talk to more than most people, but her heart did not seem to understand logic. In early June, on a bright Saturday morning, Matthew came into the mercantile with an unusual request. "I was wondering if you might be willing to come out to my place and give me your opinion on something," he said, looking almost nervous. "I have the frame of the house up, but I am not sure about the interior layout. You mentioned your father was a carpenter, and I value your judgment." Clara's first instinct was to say no. It would not be proper for an unmarried woman to visit an unmarried man's property alone. It would start talk, and she had endured enough gossip after Thomas Reed to last a lifetime, but when she looked at Matthew's face at the hope and hesitancy there, she found herself nodding. "I can come tomorrow afternoon," she said. "After church." His face lit up. "Thank you. I will come fetch you around 2 o'clock if that works." Sunday afternoon was warm and clear, with meadowlarks singing in the grass and wildflowers dotting the prairie in splashes of yellow and purple. Matthew arrived precisely at 2 with a small wagon, and he helped Clara up to the seat with a gentleness that made her heart flutter foolishly in her chest. The ride out to his property took about 30 minutes, and they talked easily about simple things. The weather, the progress of various businesses in town, a letter Clara had received from a cousin in St. Louis. It was comfortable, natural, and Clara realized she could not remember the last time she had felt this at ease with another person. When they arrived at the property, Clara was genuinely impressed. Matthew had accomplished an enormous amount of work in just 6 weeks. The barn was not only repaired but expanded, with a new roof and fresh paint. The stone foundation of the old house had been cleaned and reinforced, and a wooden frame rose from it, outlining the shape of what would become a solid, well-proportioned home. "Matthew, this is incredible," Clara said, walking around the structure. "You did all this yourself." "Had some help with the barn roof," he admitted. "Pete from the livery came out one day and would not take no for an answer, but mostly yes, it has been just me." He walked her through his vision for the house. A main room with a fireplace for cooking and heating, a separate bedroom, and a loft above for additional sleeping space or storage. As he talked, Clara found herself making suggestions, pointing out where windows would catch the best light, how he could add a small pantry off the main room where a porch would provide shade in the summer heat. "You should have been an architect," Matthew said admiringly. "You see things I would never have thought of." "I just know what makes a house feel like a home," Clara replied, running her hand along one of the wooden beams. "My parents' house was small but well planned. Every space had a purpose. Nothing was wasted." They spent over an hour discussing the house, and then Matthew showed her the rest of the property. He had cleared a space for a garden, already planted with neat rows of vegetables that were just beginning to sprout. He had reinforced the fencing in the pasture and had plans to buy a few cattle and some chickens once the house was finished. The creek that ran through the property was clear and swift, lined with cottonwood trees that provided shade and shelter. "It is beautiful here," Clara said, standing by the creek and watching the water flow over smooth stones. "Peaceful." "It is," Matthew agreed, standing beside her. "Sometimes I still cannot believe it is mine. I keep expecting someone to tell me it is a mistake, that I do not deserve this." Clara turned to look at him. "Why would you think you do not deserve it?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the water. "I have done things I am not proud of," he said finally. "During the war and after, I was angry for a long time at the world and at myself. I drifted because I did not think I deserved to settle down to have a real life. Men like me were supposed to just fade away and be forgotten." "What changed?" Clara asked softly. "I got tired," Matthew said simply. "Tired of being angry, tired of being alone. I woke up one morning in a boarding house in Kansas and realized I was 30 years old and had nothing to show for my life except scars and regrets. I decided that had to change. So I saved every penny I could, and when I had enough, I went looking for a place where I could start over." "And you found Redemption Creek?" "I found Redemption Creek," he confirmed, "and I found," he stopped, seeming to think better of whatever he was about to say. "I found a chance to build something. That is enough." But Clara had heard the pause, had seen the way his eyes had flickered to her face before he looked away. She wondered what he had been about to say, and part of her desperately wanted to know while another part was terrified to find out. They returned to town as the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. When Matthew helped Clara down from the wagon in front of the mercantile, his hands lingered on her waist just a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for coming today," he said. "It meant a lot to me. Your opinion, I mean." "You are welcome," Clara replied, trying to ignore the way her skin tingled where he had touched her. "I think you are building something wonderful out there, Matthew. You should be proud." "I will be prouder when it is finished," he said. "And when people stop calling me just a drifter." "Some people will always talk," Clara said. "The only opinion that should matter is your own. You know who you are and what you are working toward. That is what counts." He smiled at her, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his whole face. "You are a wise woman, Clara Thompson." "I just have good common sense," she replied, but she was smiling too. As she watched him drive away, Clara realized she was in serious danger of falling in love with Matthew Kane, and the thought terrified her more than anything had in a long time. Because if she let herself love him and he left, if he turned out to be just another drifter after all, she was not sure her heart could survive being broken twice. But the weeks continued to pass, and Matthew did not leave. He worked tirelessly on his property, and slowly the house began to take shape. Walls went up, a roof was added, and windows were installed. Every time he came to town, there was visible progress, tangible proof that he was building something permanent. And every time he came to town, he found a reason to spend a little extra time at the mercantile, talking to Clara about something more than just supplies. They discussed books, though neither of them had much time for reading. They talked about their childhoods, hers growing up in Redemption Creek, his moving from place to place as his father chased various failed business ventures. They debated politics and religion, discovering they agreed on some things and disagreed on others, but always with mutual respect. The town began to notice. Mrs. Henderson made pointed comments about how much time Clara spent talking to that drifter. Jenny Wilson pouted and flirted harder when Matthew was around, but he remained polite and distant with her. And Sheriff Harding's jaw got tighter every time he saw Matthew and Clara together. One evening in late June, as Clara was closing up the mercantile, Harding appeared at her door. "Clara, I need to talk to you," he said, his voice serious. "If this is about Matthew Kane," Clara began, but Harding cut her off. "It is exactly about Matthew Kane. Clara, you are a smart woman and you have been hurt before. I do not want to see you make the same mistake twice." "Matthew is nothing like Thomas Reed," Clara said sharply. "How do you know?" Harding demanded. "What do you really know about him, Clara? He is a drifter with a past he will not talk about. He has no family, no connections, no ties to anything. What is to stop him from selling that property and moving on the minute he gets bored or restless?" "He is not going to do that," Clara said, but she heard the uncertainty in her own voice. "You do not know that," Harding pressed. "Clara, I care about you. I have been patient, giving you time after what Reed did to you. But I cannot stand by and watch you throw yourself at another man who is just going to break your heart." "I am not throwing myself at anyone," Clara said, anger rising in her chest. "Matthew is my customer and my friend." And honestly, Jacob, what I do and who I spend time with is none of your business." Harding's face darkened. "I am the sheriff of this town. It is my business when one of our citizens might be in danger." "I am not in danger," Clara said firmly, "but I am done with this conversation." "Good night, Sheriff." She closed the door before he could respond, her hands shaking with anger and something uncomfortably close to fear. Not fear of Matthew, but fear that Harding might be right, that she was being foolish and naive, that she was letting herself care for someone who would inevitably leave. She did not sleep well that night, and the next morning she was tired and irritable when Matthew came into the mercantile. He took one look at her face and frowned. "What is wrong?" he asked. "Nothing," Clara said automatically, then sighed. "It is not your concern. If something is bothering you, it is my concern," Matthew said quietly. "At least, I would like it to be." Clara looked at him, at the genuine worry in his eyes, and something inside her cracked. "People are talking," she said. "About us. About how much time we spend together. The sheriff came by last night to warn me about you, to tell me I was being foolish." Matthew's expression closed off, all the warmth draining from his face. "I see." "No, you do not see," Clara said urgently. "I do not care what they say, I do not care if the whole town talks, but I need to know." She stopped, not sure how to continue. "You need to know if I am staying," Matthew finished for her, "if this is real or if I am just another Thomas Reed." "Yes," Clara whispered. Matthew came around the counter slowly, giving her time to move away if she wanted to. She did not move. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could see the flecks of blue in his gray eyes. "Clara, I cannot promise you that everything will be perfect," he said. "I cannot promise that building this life will be easy or that there will not be hard times. But I can promise you that I am not leaving. I bought that land because I want to build a life here. And if I am being completely honest, a big part of the reason I want to build that life is standing right in front of me." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Matthew, I know you have been hurt," he continued. "I know you have reasons not to trust easily. But Clara, I have been half in love with you since the first day I walked into this store and you looked at me like I was a person instead of just another drifter. I did not come to Redemption Creek looking for love. I came looking for a fresh start, but I found both and I am not fool enough to walk away from that." "Half in love," Clara managed, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Maybe more than half," Matthew admitted. "Maybe all the way in love, if I am being honest." Clara had built so many walls around her heart, had sworn she would never let anyone in again. But standing here, looking into Matthew's face and seeing nothing but sincerity and hope and vulnerability, she felt those walls crumbling. "I am scared," she said honestly. "I am scared of trusting you and being wrong." "I am scared too," Matthew said. "I am scared of not being good enough, of disappointing you, of failing at this life I am trying to build. But Clara, being scared is not a reason to not try. It is just a reason to try harder." He reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and took her hand in his. His palm was rough with calluses, warm and strong, and Clara felt something settle in her chest, like a piece of a puzzle clicking into place. "I see you," she said softly. "I see a man building a life, working hard, proving every day that he is more than what people whisper about. I see someone kind and honest and determined. And yes, I think I might be falling in love with you too." The smile that broke across Matthew's face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. "Might be," he teased gently. Clara corrected, feeling a matching smile tug at her own lips. "Am falling in love with you." He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture so old-fashioned and sweet that Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Then I am the luckiest man in Redemption Creek," Matthew said. "And I am going to spend every day proving to you that your trust is not misplaced." From that day forward, Matthew and Clara made no secret of their relationship. They were careful to be proper. Matthew never stayed late at the mercantile after closing, and Clara made sure they were seen in public places when they spent time together. But it was clear to everyone in town that they were courting. The reactions were mixed. Some people, like Pete from the livery and Reverend Matthews, were genuinely happy for them. Others, like Mrs. Henderson and Sheriff Harding, remained disapproving. And still others watched with curiosity, waiting to see if the drifter would indeed stay, or if he would prove the doubters right by leaving. Matthew seemed determined to prove the doubters wrong. He finished the house in late July, and it was a solid, beautiful structure that looked like it had been there for years instead of months. He bought 6 head of cattle, a dozen chickens, and a milk cow. He plowed and planted fields, repaired fences, and even built a chicken coop that was so well constructed that Pete joked he should go into the carpentry business. And through it all, Matthew made time for Clara. He took her on picnics by the creek on Sunday afternoons. He came to town on Saturday evenings, and they would walk together along Main Street, talking about everything and nothing. He brought her wildflowers that he picked from his property, and once, memorably, a baby rabbit he had rescued from a hawk, which Clara kept in a box in the storeroom until it was old enough to be released. Clara found herself happier than she had been in years, maybe happier than she had ever been. Matthew made her laugh with his dry sense of humor. He listened when she talked about the challenges of running the mercantile alone. He never tried to tell her how to do things or act like her work was less important than his. He treated her as an equal, a partner, someone whose opinions and ideas mattered. In early August, Matthew asked Clara to have dinner with him at his house. It was a bold move, scandalous even, for an unmarried woman to visit an unmarried man's home. But Clara said yes without hesitation, because she trusted Matthew and because she was curious to see the finished house. She rode out on a Saturday afternoon, bringing fresh bread and a pie she had made that morning. The house looked even better than she had imagined, with a wide front porch and cheerful red curtains in the windows. Matthew had clearly worked hard to make it presentable, and as he showed her around the interior, Clara could see all the little touches he had added: built-in shelves in the main room, a proper pantry with hooks for hanging herbs, a bedroom with large windows that let in the afternoon light. "Matthew, it is wonderful," she said sincerely. "You should be so proud of what you have built here." "I am proud," he said, "but it feels empty somehow, like it is missing something important." He had made dinner, a simple but well-cooked meal of steak and potatoes and green beans from his garden. They ate at a small table he had built himself, and Clara thought how strange and wonderful it felt to sit here in this house with this man, feeling more at home than she had in her own rooms above the mercantile. After dinner, as they sat on the front porch watching the sun set over the prairie, Matthew turned to her with a serious expression. "Clara, I need to tell you something about my past, about who I was before I came here." Clara's stomach tightened with apprehension, but she nodded. "All right." "During the war, I did terrible things," Matthew said, his voice low and pained. "I killed men. Not just in battle, but in raids and skirmishes that had nothing to do with military strategy and everything to do with revenge and anger. After the war, I drifted for years, drinking too much, fighting too much, being the kind of man mothers warn their daughters about. I was in jail twice, once for public drunkenness and once for assault when I broke a man's jaw in a bar fight." He paused, and Clara reached over and took his hand, squeezing gently to show she was still listening, still here. "About 3 years ago, I hit rock bottom," Matthew continued. "I was in a town in Missouri, drunk and angry, and I got into a fight with 3 men. They were going to kill me, probably would have if the sheriff had not broken it up. He threw me in jail for a week, and when I got out, he sat me down and told me I had 2 choices. I could keep going the way I was and end up dead in a ditch before I was 35, or I could decide to be something different, something better. He gave me a job as a deputy, even though I did not deserve it. He taught me how to control my temper, how to channel my energy into something productive, and slowly, over 2 years, I became a different person." "What happened then?" Clara asked softly. "Sheriff Walters died," Matthew said. Heart attack sudden and unexpected. The town wanted me to take over as sheriff, but I could not do it. I did not trust myself with that much authority, that much power. So I left. I spent a year doing ranch work, saving my money and thinking about what I wanted my life to be, and then I came here. He turned to look at her, and she could see the fear in his eyes, the worry that she would reject him now that she knew the truth. "I am not that man anymore, Clara," he said. "I have not had a drink in 3 years. I have not raised my fist in anger since I left Missouri. But I needed you to know who I was, what I am capable of, before we go any further. You deserve to know the truth." Clara was quiet for a moment, processing everything he had told her. She could feel Matthew tensing beside her, waiting for her judgment, and her heart ached for him. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. "I know that could not have been easy. Are you," Matthew's voice cracked slightly, "are you going to end things between us?" "No," Clara said firmly. "Matthew, we all have pasts. We have all done things we regret. What matters is not who you were but who you are now, and the man I know is good and kind and honorable. That is who I am in love with." She saw the tension drain out of him, saw the relief and gratitude flood his face. "I do not deserve you," he said roughly. "Yes, you do," Clara replied. "You deserve happiness and love and a life that brings you peace. We both do." He pulled her close then, wrapping his arms around her, and Clara rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. They sat like that as the stars came out, as the night sounds of the prairie rose around them, and Clara felt more certain than she had ever been that this was right, that this man was her future. But the past has a way of catching up with people, and Matthew's was no exception. In mid-September, a stranger rode into Redemption Creek asking questions about Matthew Kane. He was a hard-looking man with a badge pinned to his vest and cold eyes that missed nothing. His name was Marshal Frank Hollis, and he had come from Missouri. Clara heard about his arrival from Pete, who came into the mercantile that morning looking worried. "There is a marshal in town asking about Matthew," he said without preamble. "Says he has questions about something that happened in Missouri a few years back." Clara's blood ran cold. "What kind of questions?" "Would not say," Pete replied. "But Clara, he has that look, the look of a lawman who thinks he has found something." Clara closed the mercantile immediately, something she never did in the middle of a business day, and went looking for Matthew. She found him on Main Street, standing in front of the sheriff's office with Marshal Hollis and Sheriff Harding. Matthew's face was pale but composed, and when he saw Clara approaching, he shook his head slightly, a clear message for her to stay back. She ignored the message and walked right up to them. "What is going on?" she demanded. "This is official business, Clara," Sheriff Harding said, but there was something in his tone, was that satisfaction, that made her even angrier. "Marshal Hollis here has some questions about a robbery that took place in Willow Creek, Missouri, 3 years ago," Harding continued. "Seems there is some evidence that points to Matthew being involved." "That is ridiculous," Clara said hotly. "Matthew was a deputy in Nebraska 3 years ago. Sheriff Walters will vouch for him." "Sheriff Walters is dead," Marshal Hollis said flatly. "And the robbery took place in early June of 1873, before Kane took up his position in Nebraska. We have a witness who identified him from a photograph." "What photograph?" Matthew asked, his voice steady. "I have never had my photograph taken." "Army photograph," Hollis replied. "From your service record, the witness was quite certain." "Witnesses can be wrong," Clara interjected. "People make mistakes with identification all the time." Hollis looked at her with something like pity. "Ma'am, I understand you have feelings for this man, but you need to let the law handle this." "I did not rob anyone," Matthew said clearly. "In June of 1873, I was working on a cattle drive from Texas to Kansas. I can give you the name of the trail boss and at least a dozen cowhands who were with me for 6 weeks straight. We did not reach Kansas until late July." Hollis's expression flickered with uncertainty. "You have proof of that?" "I have the name of the trail boss, Jim Patterson." Last I heard, he was running a ranch outside of Abilene, and I have a pay stub from that drive that is dated. It is in my house." "Then I will need to see that," Holly said, "and I will need to wire Abilene and verify your story. Until then, I am going to have to ask you to consider yourself under watch." "He is not going anywhere," Clara said firmly. "He has a home here, a business, a life. He is not running." Matthew looked at her, and she saw gratitude and love in his eyes. "I am not running," he echoed. "I will cooperate fully with your investigation, Marshal. I have nothing to hide." Over the next week, Redemption Creek buzzed with gossip. Some people were convinced Matthew was guilty, that he had been hiding his criminal past all along. Others, a smaller but vocal group, believed he was innocent and being wrongly accused. Clara found herself defending Matthew constantly, losing patience with customers who made snide comments and nearly throwing misses. Henderson out of the mercantile when she suggested Clara was being naive and foolish. Matthew remained calm through it all, providing the marshal with every piece of documentation he had, giving names and dates and details that could be verified. He continued working his land, tending his animals, living his life as though nothing had changed, even though Clara could see the strain in his face, the worry in his eyes. The break came 10 days after Marshal Hollis arrived. A telegram came through from Abilene confirming that Matthew had indeed been on the cattle drive during the time in question. Jim Patterson remembered him clearly and confirmed the dates. The pay stub Matthew had provided matched the records Patterson had kept. And when Hollis wired back to Willow Creek with this information, another telegram came saying that they had arrested a different man for the robbery, someone who actually matched the description much more closely and who had confessed to the crime. Marshal Hollis rode out to Matthew's property to deliver the news personally, and Clara insisted on going with him. When they arrived, Matthew was repairing fence posts in the far pasture, his shirt off and his skin gleaming with sweat in the September sun. "Mr. Kane," Hollis called out, "I owe you an apology. The real robber has been caught and confessed. You are cleared of all suspicion." Clara watched Matthew's shoulders sag with relief, saw him brace his hands on the fence post and bow his head. She dismounted and ran to him, and he caught her in his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "It is over," he murmured into her hair. "It is finally over." "I knew you were innocent," Clara said fiercely. "I never doubted you for a second." When they finally pulled apart, Marshal Hollis was looking uncomfortable. "Again, I apologize for the trouble," he said. "I was just doing my job, following up on the lead we had." "I understand," Matthew said. "No hard feelings, Marshal." After Hollis left, Matthew and Clara sat together on his front porch, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the land. "I was so scared," Matthew admitted. "Not of being arrested because I knew I was innocent, but I was scared of losing everything I had built here, losing you." "You will never lose me," Clara said. "I meant what I said, Matthew. I love you, and I am not going anywhere." He turned to her then, taking both her hands in his. "Clara Thompson, I know I should wait longer, do this properly with your family's permission and all the traditional steps. But I cannot wait. Life is too short and too uncertain. Will you marry me? Will you be my wife and build this life with me?" Clara felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were happy tears, joyful tears. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." He kissed her then, right there on the porch in broad daylight where anyone who happened to ride by could see them, and Clara did not care one bit. She kissed him back with all the love and hope and certainty in her heart, and when they finally broke apart, both of them were smiling. They were married 3 weeks later, on a crisp October morning with the cottonwoods turning gold and the air smelling of autumn. Reverend Matthews performed the ceremony in the little church on Main Street, and half the town turned out to witness it, even Mrs. Henderson came, though she sniffed disapprovingly through the whole thing. Sheriff Harding was notably absent. Clara wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in tissue paper for years, and carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Matthew had picked that morning from their land. She said their land now, because it was hers too, the place where they would build their future together. Matthew wore a new suit that Clara had ordered special from St. Louis, and when he saw her walking down the aisle toward him, his face transformed with such obvious love and joy that several women in the congregation sighed audibly. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Matthews began, and Clara felt like her heart might burst with happiness. They held the reception at the Silver Star Saloon, which Jenny Wilson's father had offered to host for free. There was food and music and dancing, and for one day the whole town seemed to forget that Matthew Kane had ever been called a drifter. He was one of them now, a landowner, a businessman, a married man. He had put down roots just as he had promised. As the sun set and the celebration continued around them, Matthew led Clara outside for a moment of quiet. "Are you happy?" he asked, pulling her close. "I am happier than I ever thought possible," Clara replied honestly. "Are you?" "I keep thinking I am going to wake up and discover this is all a dream," Matthew said, "that I am still just a drifter sleeping rough somewhere and none of this is real." "It is real," Clara assured him. "This is real, we are real, and we have the rest of our lives to prove it." They returned to Matthew's house, their house now, that evening as husband and wife. Matthew carried Clara over the threshold, both of them laughing, and set her down gently in the main room. The fire was burning in the fireplace, casting warm light over the space, and Clara looked around at this home they would share and felt a deep sense of rightness, of belonging. Their wedding night was sweet and tender, full of nervous laughter and gentle discovery. Matthew was patient and careful, making sure Clara felt safe and loved every moment, and when they finally came together as one, Clara felt like she had found the missing piece of herself she had been searching for without even knowing it. Afterward, lying in Matthew's arms in their bed, listening to his heartbeat beneath her ear, Clara whispered, "I love you." "I love you too," Matthew replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Thank you for seeing me, Clara. For seeing the man I was trying to become instead of just the drifter I had been. Thank you for staying," Clara said, "for building a life instead of just passing through." "I will never just pass through anywhere again," Matthew promised. "This is home, you are home." The first year of their marriage was full of both challenges and joys. Clara continued running the mercantile, but now Matthew helped her in his spare time, using his carpentry skills to build better storage shelves and repair parts of the building that had been slowly deteriorating. The business thrived with both of them working together, and they were able to expand their inventory and start offering credit to farmers who needed supplies but would not have money until harvest time. On the farm, Matthew continued to build and improve. He added to his cattle herd, built a proper smokehouse, and planted an orchard of apple and pear trees that would not bear fruit for several years, but represented faith in the future. Clara helped with everything, learning to milk the cow, gathering eggs from the chickens, tending the vegetable garden that provided much of their food. They fell into routines and rhythms, learning the cadence of married life. They discovered that Matthew was an early riser who liked to work in the quiet dawn hours, while Clara was more productive in the evenings. They learned that Matthew got quiet when he was worried, while Clara talked more. They had their first real argument about whether to buy a new plow or repair the old one, and learned how to fight fair and apologize and move forward. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the whispers about Matthew stopped. He was no longer just a drifter in people's minds. He was Matthew Kane, Clara's husband, the man who owned the old Peterson place and had made it prosper. He was the man who helped neighbors when they needed it, who paid his bills on time, who attended church on Sundays and contributed to community projects. He had become part of Redemption Creek, woven into the fabric of the town as securely as anyone born there. In the spring of their second year of marriage, Clara discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but when Doc Morrison confirmed it, she felt a rush of emotions so intense she had to sit down. Joy, certainly, but also fear. Her own mother had nearly died giving birth to a stillborn son when Clara was 10, and the memory of that terrifying time had never fully left her. She told Matthew that evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, and she watched his face cycle through shock, joy, and then concern as he saw her expression. "You are scared," he said, pulling her close. "A little," Clara admitted. "I am happy, truly I am, but I am also scared." "I am scared too," Matthew confessed. "I am terrified of being a father, of not being good enough, of failing this child somehow. But Clara, we will do this together, just like we do everything else, and I will be with you every step of the way." True to his word, Matthew was incredibly attentive throughout Clara's pregnancy. He took over more of her work at the mercantile, insisted she rest whenever she felt tired, and worried constantly even though Doc Morrison assured them both that Clara was healthy and strong. As her belly grew round with their child, Matthew would talk to it at night, telling stories about what their life would be like, and Clara would fall asleep to the sound of his deep voice rumbling against her back. In November, on a cold night with snow falling softly outside, Clara went into labor. It was long and difficult, and there were moments when Clara was sure she could not continue, that the pain was too much. But Matthew never left her side, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, murmuring encouragement and love, and finally, as dawn broke over the prairie, their son was born. He came into the world screaming lustily, red-faced and perfect, and when Doc Morrison placed him in Clara's arms, she felt such overwhelming love that she started crying. Matthew was crying too, tears streaming down his face as he looked at his wife and son with wonder. "He is beautiful," Matthew whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand with one finger. "He is perfect." They named him Jacob Matthew Cain, Jacob after Clara's father and Matthew after his own. Little Jake, as they quickly started calling him, looked just like his father with dark hair and serious gray eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. The first months of parenthood were exhausting and wonderful. Clara had never known it was possible to be so tired and so happy at the same time. Jake was a good baby, healthy and strong, but he demanded constant attention. Matthew proved to be a natural father, patient and gentle, singing to Jake in a surprisingly good baritone and walking him around the house at 2 in the morning when he would not settle. The whole town seemed to delight in the new addition to the Cain family. Women Clara barely knew brought by meals and baby clothes. Pete carved a beautiful wooden rattle. Even Mrs. Henderson softened, arriving one day with a knitted blanket and a grudging admission that perhaps she had been wrong about Matthew Cain. As Jake grew from infant to toddler, the Cain farm continued to prosper. Matthew had expanded his cattle operation and was now supplying beef to several towns in the area. Clara had turned the mercantile into one of the most successful businesses in Redemption Creek, known for fair prices and quality goods. They had paid off the loan Matthew had taken to buy the property and were even able to save money in the bank. When Jake was 3, Clara became pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. Their daughter was born on a warm May evening, arriving so quickly that Doc Morrison barely made it to the house in time. She had Clara's red-gold hair and Matthew's serious eyes, and they named her Rose Elizabeth after both their mothers. Jake was initially suspicious of this small creature who took up so much of his parents' attention, but within a week he had decided she was his baby sister and he was her sworn protector. Clara often found him sitting next to Rose's cradle, talking to her in his high, childish voice about all the things they would do together when she got bigger. Life settled into a new rhythm with 2 children. The house that had once seemed spacious now felt full of life and noise and love. Matthew added a room to the house, turning the loft into a proper bedroom for Jake and building a nursery off the main bedroom for Rose. He also built a swing in the big cottonwood tree near the creek, and on summer evenings the whole family would go down there, with Jake playing in the water while Clara nursed Rose in the shade, and Matthew worked on whatever project he had brought along. "Are you happy?" Matthew asked Clara one evening as they watched Jake chase fireflies in the twilight. Rose was asleep in Clara's arms, her tiny fist curled against her mother's chest. "I am so happy I am almost afraid to say it out loud," Clara admitted. "Sometimes I worry that if I acknowledge how good things are, something bad will happen." "Nothing bad is going to happen," Matthew said firmly. "We have built something strong here, Clara, something that will last." And he was right. Years passed and their life together grew richer and deeper. Jake grew into a serious, responsible boy who loved working alongside his father on the farm. Rose was bright and curious, always asking questions and getting into mischief. When she was 4, they had another son, Samuel, who was the opposite of Jake, loud and boisterous and fearless. The farm expanded to include more land when the neighboring property came up for sale, and Matthew was able to buy it. The mercantile became successful enough that Clara was able to hire help, giving her more time to spend at home with the children. They added more rooms to the house, a proper parlor and a study where Matthew kept the books for both the farm and the mercantile. Their children grew up strong and healthy, surrounded by love and security. Jake eventually took over most of the farm operations, proving to have an even better head for business than his father. Rose became a teacher, opening a small school in Redemption Creek. Samuel, restless and adventurous, went east to college and came back with a degree in veterinary medicine, setting up practice in town. Through it all, through the years and the changes and the growth, Matthew and Clara remained the center of each other's worlds. They still took walks together on Sunday evenings when weather permitted. They still sat on the porch and talked about their day, their dreams, their plans. They still reached for each other in the night, finding comfort and passion in the familiar touch of a beloved partner. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Matthew took Clara back to the spot where their house stood, to the place where he had first shown her his vision for what this property could become. They stood there as the sun set, his arm around her waist, and looked at everything they had built together. The house that had grown from a simple 2-room structure to a sprawling home filled with life and love, the barn and outbuildings, the fields of grain waving in the breeze, the cattle grazing peacefully in the pasture. "Do you remember what I told you when I first brought you here?" Matthew asked. "You said it felt empty," Clara replied, "that it was missing something important." "It was missing you," Matthew said, turning to face her. "Everything I built here, I built because I wanted to create something worthy of you, a life worthy of your love." "You did not need to build anything to be worthy of my love," Clara said, reaching up to touch his face. Gray was threading through his dark hair now, and there were lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun, but to her he was still the most handsome man she had ever seen. "You were always worthy, from the very first day." "The town called me just a drifter," Matthew said softly. "But you saw something different." "I saw a man building a life," Clara said, "and I was right. You built an incredible life, Matthew. We built it together." He kissed her then, gentle and sweet and full of 25 years of love and partnership and shared history. When they pulled apart, both of them were smiling. They continued to stand there as the stars came out, as the night sounds of the prairie rose around them, and Clara thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. She thought about the scared young woman she had been, afraid to trust again after having her heart broken. She thought about the weary drifter who had ridden into town with nothing but determination and hope. And she thought about how they had found each other against all odds, how they had built something beautiful and lasting from nothing more than hard work and faith and love. Years continued to pass. They became grandparents when Jake married a sweet girl from Cooper's Bend and gave them 2 grandsons. Rose married a rancher from a neighboring town and added 2 granddaughters to the family. Samuel brought home a wife from back east, a sharp-minded woman who became a doctor herself and worked alongside him in the veterinary practice. Matthew's hair turned completely white, and he moved a little slower than he once had, but he remained strong and active, still working the land he loved. Clara's red-gold hair faded to a softer auburn shot through with silver, and she finally retired from running the mercantile, turning it over to a young couple who promised to maintain its reputation for quality and fairness. They spent their later years much as they had spent their earlier ones, together, working side by side, finding joy in simple things. They watched their children build their own lives and families. They spoiled their grandchildren outrageously. They sat on their porch on summer evenings and winter afternoons, holding hands and watching the land they loved change with the seasons. On a warm September evening, when they had been married for 43 years, Matthew and Clara sat on that same porch where so much of their life together had unfolded. Matthew was 71 now, Clara 66, and they had been blessed with good health and long life. The sun was setting in a blaze of orange and gold, and the prairie grass rippled in the breeze like waves on an ocean. "I have been thinking about the day I rode into Redemption Creek," Matthew said, breaking a comfortable silence. "I was so lost back then, Clara. I had no idea what I was looking for or what I needed. I just knew I could not keep drifting forever." "And now?" Clara asked, squeezing his hand. "Now I know exactly what I needed," Matthew said. "A home, a purpose. I needed you, Clara, even before I knew you existed. You saved me." "We saved each other," Clara corrected gently. "I was just as lost as you were, Matthew, just in a different way. You taught me that it was safe to trust again, to love again. You showed me that not every man who rides into town is going to break my heart and leave." "I never left," Matthew said. "I built a life instead. We built a life. The best life," Clara agreed. "I would not change a single thing about it." They sat together as the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, as they had done thousands of times before. Matthew's arm was around Clara's shoulders, and her head rested against his chest, and they were content in a way that only comes from a lifetime of love and partnership and shared joy and sorrow. The years continued their gentle march forward. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The whole town of Redemption Creek turned out for the celebration, held at the community hall that had been built 20 years ago with significant financial contribution from the Kane family. Sheriff Harding had long since retired and moved away, replaced by a younger man who respected Matthew and often came to him for advice. Mrs. Henderson had passed away 5 years earlier, taking her disapproval and gossip with her. Pete from the livery was still alive, ancient and crotchety, but he made a point of telling anyone who would listen that he had known from the start that Matthew Kane was a good man, despite what everyone else had whispered. At the anniversary celebration, Jake stood up to give a toast. He was 48 now, a successful rancher and businessman in his own right, and he looked remarkably like his father had at the same age. "When I was a boy," Jake said, his voice carrying across the crowded hall, "I remember hearing people call my father a drifter. They said he would not stay, that he would leave as soon as something better came along. But my father did not leave. He stayed and built something incredible. He showed me that a man's past does not define his future, that with hard work and determination and love, anyone can create the life they want. Dad, Mom, thank you for showing me what real commitment looks like. Thank you for building not just a farm or a business, but a family, a legacy, a life worth living." There was not a dry eye in the hall by the time Jake finished, and Matthew had to wipe tears from his own eyes before he could stand to respond. "Thank you, son," he said simply. "And thank all of you for being part of our lives, for accepting a stranger and giving him a chance to prove himself. But most of all, thank you to my wife, my Clara, who saw a man building a life when everyone else just saw a drifter. Everything good in my life comes from that moment when she decided to take a chance on me." He turned to Clara, who was crying openly now, and raised his glass. "To my wife," he said, My partner, my best friend, my love, thank you for 50 incredible years. I hope we have at least 50 more. Clara laughed through her tears. I will do my best, she said. They did not get 50 more years because no one lives forever. But they got 10 more good years together, years filled with the quiet joy that comes from a life well lived. They watched their great-grandchildren grow. They took gentle walks around the property that held so many memories. They sat on their porch and held hands and talked about everything and nothing, secure in a love that had only deepened with time. Matthew died on a cold January morning just after his 81st birthday, peacefully in his sleep with Clara beside him. His heart, the doctor said, had simply worn out after a long and full life. Clara held his hand as he took his last breath, and though her heart was breaking, she was grateful that he had gone peacefully, without pain, in the home he had built with his own hands. The funeral was one of the largest Redemption Creek had ever seen. People came from towns 40 miles away to pay their respects to the man who had ridden in as a drifter and become one of the most respected citizens in the territory. His children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren filled the front pews of the church, a testament to the legacy he had left behind. Clara lived for 5 more years after Matthew died, years that were harder than any she had known. She missed him with an ache that never fully went away, missed the sound of his voice and the touch of his hand, and the way he looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. But she was surrounded by family and love, and she took comfort in knowing that everything they had built together would continue long after they were both gone. She spent her last years living with Rose and her family, helping with the great-grandchildren and telling stories about the old days, about the cowboy who had ridden into town with nothing but hope and determination. She told them about how the whole town had whispered that he was just a drifter, but she had seen something different. She had seen a man building a life, and she had been brave enough to build that life with him. Clara died on a warm June evening, sitting on her daughter's porch and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. She simply closed her eyes and did not open them again, slipping away as gently as a sigh. She was 81 years old, the same age Matthew had been when he passed, and those who loved her liked to think that he had been waiting for her, ready to take her hand and walk with her into whatever came next. They buried her next to Matthew on a hill overlooking the property they had loved, under the shade of cottonwood trees they had planted together 50 years earlier. The headstone was simple, bearing both their names and the dates of their births and deaths, but beneath that it read, "He built a life. She saw the man he could become. Together they built a legacy of love, and that legacy did continue." The farm remained in the family, passed down through Jake's line, and then to his children and grandchildren. The original house still stood, expanded and modernized over the years, but still solid at its core, just as Matthew had built it. The mercantile changed hands several times, but always remained a cornerstone of Redemption Creek, and a plaque near the door honored Clara Thompson Kane as its founder. But more than the physical legacy of buildings and businesses and land, Matthew and Clara left behind something more precious, a family that knew the value of hard work and commitment, that understood that love was not just a feeling but a choice made every day, that believed in second chances and new beginnings, and the power of seeing the best in people. Their story became part of Redemption Creek's history, told and retold through the generations. It was the story of the drifter who became a pillar of the community, of the woman who had the courage to trust again, of two people who found each other against all odds and built something beautiful that lasted far beyond their own lives. And on quiet evenings, when the sun set over the prairie in shades of orange and gold, when the meadowlark sang in the grass and the wind whispered through the cottonwood trees, it was easy to imagine two figures sitting on the porch of the old Kane house, hand in hand, watching over the land they loved and the family they had created. They had started with nothing but hope and determination. They had faced doubt and suspicion and hardship. But they had persevered, and in the end, they had built not just a life but a love story for the ages. A testament to the power of seeing people not for who they have been but for who they are becoming, and the magic that happens when two souls find each other and decide to build a future together. The townspeople of Redemption Creek no longer whispered about the drifter who had ridden in on that April morning so many years ago. Instead, they told the story of Matthew and Clara Kane with pride and admiration, holding them up as an example of what was possible when love and hard work and faith came together. They were a reminder that sometimes the best things in life come from taking a chance on someone, from looking past the surface to see the heart beneath, from choosing to build rather than drift. And perhaps that was the greatest legacy of all, not the land or the buildings or even the family, precious as all those things were, but the lesson that it is never too late to change your life, to become someone different, to build something lasting and good. Matthew Kane had ridden into Redemption Creek as a drifter, but he had stayed and become so much more. And Clara Thompson had been a wounded, wary woman afraid to trust, but she had found the courage to love again. Together they had created something that would outlast them both, a love that had transformed not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone who knew them, a story that would be told as long as Redemption Creek existed, a reminder that sometimes the person everyone else dismisses as just a drifter is actually a man building a life, and all he needs is someone willing to see it. The prairie remained, vast and beautiful and unchanging in its essential nature, even as everything else evolved and shifted. The creek still ran clear and cold through what had once been the Peterson place and was now forever known as the Kane homestead. The cottonwood trees grew tall and strong, their leaves whispering secrets in the wind. And somewhere in the fabric of that land, woven into its very essence, was the love story of two people who had found each other when they needed it most and built a life that proved that redemption was always possible. That home was not a place but a person, and that the greatest adventure of all was choosing to stay when everyone expected you to leave. Their story ended as all stories must, but the love they had shared and the life they had built continued to ripple outward through time, touching lives they would never know, inspiring people they would never meet, proving again and again that sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the simplest of moments. A stranger riding into town, a woman behind a counter, and the decision to see beyond the surface to the possibility beneath.